Okay, welcome to episode 9 of the SumerSports show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm the VP of Research and Development at SumerSports. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitrov, the CEO at SumerSports. Thomas, you're at our office in Palm Springs, Florida. I'm at my house in Cincinnati. However, my wife was gracious enough. People were making fun of me, not on this show, but other shows I would go on. People were making fun of me because the black backdrop was like causing this glow around my head as if I was some sort of like angel, which everybody who knows me knows I'm not. So my wife did a great job of moving this over here. You got like a Randy Moss pennant from my childhood, some random 49ers pennant that I have before, a football signed by the 1994 Minnesota Vikings. So I'm certainly in the belly of the beast here, but you're all the way down, experiencing great weather in Florida. How's it going, Thomas?
Everything's great. I see the Nebraska plate as well popping. You're indirectly talking about your new head coach out at Nebraska and where you got that's where you got your PhD, right?
That's right. I spent a solid 4 years in Nebraska, really enjoyed it. And yeah, that was where I got my doctorate. So, just kind of symbols from the past and, old baseball prospectus books that I used to read when I was more into baseball than football. So yeah, it's fun. How's Florida treating you right now?
It's good. I come down here 2 days a week, and I just so happen to be here on a Wednesday. So I was rushing around. We have all kinds of stuff going on. When you're in the office, it's a lot different. I'm still making my pitch to get a satellite office in Atlanta and trying to cajole you to come down there one day. It's a whole other topic, but it's hot as Haiti down here at times. I'm used to right now. Atlanta's just right at that spot, right? 65. I'm trying to walk over to Starbucks a minute ago, and I was just drenched. So I have to get used to that again.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny. I've only been to Atlanta other than the airport once in my life. There was a joint mathematics meeting there in the January of it was your Super Bowl run. It was January of 2017, and you might remember this. I had a bunch of students as part of one of my programs, and there was about 2 inches of snow that week, and we were stuck in Atlanta for a week based upon like 2 inches of snow. So that was my Atlanta experience, but a lot of fun nonetheless during that time. And so for those of you who are listening live, we really appreciate you. You can follow, get us live on YouTube. I know we have Darius was waiting patiently in the comment section before we showed up, telling us to let us in here. But also, so I'm going to show that there. So we have a few Zach Rogers there as well. Thomas, notice we can show these comments now on the lower part of the podcast, which is cool for those that follow along. You can obviously listen to us on any podcast platform after the time as well. And then what we've been doing, because the show is so topical, is we've broken up a few different discussions. So last week we talked about Herbert and the Chargers. We also talked about Washington, the Commanders, and how they started slow and all this. We've cut a few of those up. If you go to our YouTube page, they're called SumerSports Shorts. You can just watch those 6 minutes clips of Thomas and I just talking about one topic. So a number of different ways to consume this content if you'd like to. But we generally speaking take about an hour. We'll talk about topics within the league. We might preview some games. But for sure we will also answer a ton of listener questions, as we've gotten a lot of them, given obviously your experience as the general manager with the Falcons and as well as an executive throughout the league, and mine as a director of analytics at PFF for the longest time. So one of the first topics I wanted to talk about today, Thomas, was through your experience. I think it's been really interesting as the season goes on, right? We have opinions on players and teams in the media and in sports betting and fantasy that we have to cut bait on, right? If you if you think the Dolphins stunk at the beginning of the season and you kept betting into that opinion, you're going to be broke, right? You eventually have to change your mind and say, look, Mike McDaniel looks like a great head coach. Tua appears to be great in that realm. And so you got to change opinions, right? Or else you're going to go broke in this business. And, I think it's probably ever the more necessary to do so when you're a general manager of a football team. Can you give me an example of a time when, you had an opinion on a player and that changed, how quickly it changed, like, how did it change and so on?
So, yeah, by the way, I was listening to Mike Lombardi recently on his GM Shuffle, and he was talking about, give me the scout that talks about his misses, not the scout that talks about all his hits, because you learn exponentially from your misses, right? It makes you that much better. It's everyone. It is not an exact science, right? This is why we're in the business we're in at SumerSports, right? To help eliminate some of the guesswork. There is guesswork abound, in the sort of acquisition and evaluation scene. I look back, and I hate to bring everyone back to earlier years in my GM world, but in 2009, we were in the process. We had just drafted Matt Ryan in 2008. We came back in 2009, myself and Mike Smith, and we were bullish on trying to figure out how we could bolster our defense, right? Usually that's what happens, right? You ask your head coach, and of course he's a defensive-minded guy. This is Mike Smith I'm talking about. We wanted an interior D lineman. We ended up getting Paray Jerry. You know who we passed up 2 picks later? Clay Matthews.
Yeah.
Right. And it forever haunts me. There are many, many reasons, just so everyone knows this. This wasn't an idea of us like our eyes failed us and we missed the fact that this guy was unbelievable as an athlete. If you look back, he was only a 1-year starter at USC, right? Came from great family background, of course, his dad and his grandfather. But 1 year starting, that was a concern of me, overthinking, of course. The other thing that came into play, remember, a GM has to listen to his coaching staff. He was not necessarily a good, air quote, it's horrible to hear it now, fit for us schematically. Think about that mistake. We won't get into details on that, but that ultimately taking all of that information, and we passed up on Clay Matthews for Paray Jerry, who, by the way, was a hell of an athlete, blew his knee, whatever, within 2 years. I mean, he basically was gone. It was a wiped out move seeing a guy like that. So I realized after the fact, you can overthink, and there are the really good ones out there who can take someone who might not be a great fit schematically and find a damn way to utilize a player like that with that much talent.
Yeah, you talked last episode about pillars, right? Like there's a certain aspect of like there are players that play for your team that can kind of be scheme independent. Now, Clay is an interesting one though. Like I'm going to give you a little bit of I'm going to push back a little bit on the idea that the miss was catastrophic in the sense, right? So I know Clay's dad. In fact, Clay's dad played for the Falcons. He was a great Cleveland Brown and like a good Atlanta Falcon near the end of his career. So he had the pedigree, but he was a walk-on at USC. So, and I think about when we look at modeling stuff at Sumer. So, for example, if you're trying to model what kind of contract a player is going to get, and my former colleague, Brad Spielberger at PFF, who I'll talk about a little bit later in the show, will uncover this as well. Like draft position matters, right? Now, and I sort of felt the same way like with Stephon Diggs, right? Stephon Diggs was he was like a 5-star recruit at Maryland who struggled at Maryland. He probably played undrafted level football at Maryland, but because everybody's prior on him was that he was great, he got drafted higher. And there's been a research that's been done at Wharton about this. Was there anything about that where, and I know people who scout for colleges are not the same people who scout for NFL, but is there ever a little bit of hey, this guy was not even recruited heavily. Like maybe it was just USC that made him. Is there ever a little bit of a bias there where people anchor to a previous position that was outweighed by the play on the field?
Oh, no question about it. It happens time and again when we're looking at scenarios like this. When we're talking about Clay Matthews, we talk about other players who played in a certain system. They played for a certain coach. They played for a certain school that historically just are not producing. Look, in my earlier years, we used to look back at teams like or schools like Nebraska, and we would be very leery about acquiring O-linemen, believe it or not, from a team like that because they were so beaten up by the time they got into the NFL for reasons. So when there are players out there, and we can go into recent draft moves, whether it was in San Francisco or wherever it might be around the league where those guys have not had full-on time. They've only had a year or they've had portions of a year. They haven't been able to produce the way that we need it to make a full-on evaluation. And we look at it and we think, you know what? I'd rather go with this player. The upside on the player I'm looking at is exponentially more than the player I'm probably going to take, but I have more of a safety valve here by taking this guy that's going to be good versus, the guy off the charts who might completely, it's a boom or bust element, right? And that plays into it often for us as well as team builders.
Yeah, that's so interesting, right? It's so like, to uncover these biases is to make real change. And I think it's interesting, right? The other part about Clay, by the way, which again, I'm going to back, and I actually don't remember, you guys were a 4-3 team almost your whole time there, right?
Right.
And so Clay was and this was back, the way the league is now, about 60 to 70, I think it's more like 70% of the game is played in nickel, in which case, if you're an odd man front and an even man front, the distinction is fairly minimal, right? Like you're usually in 2-4-5 nickel or 4-2-5 nickel. And the guys that play the edge, it's sort of like, who cares, right? When Ed Donatel went and took over Mike Zimmer's defense in Minnesota, Donnell Hunter went from a 4-3 end to a 3-4 outside linebacker, and there's not really a change. But back in 2009, I want to say it was more like flipped. It was more, you were playing your base, your 7, the 4-3 or the 3-4 far more. And I know Clay ended up playing some middle backer when he was with Green Bay, but there's a difference, right? Like back then, playing 3-4 outside linebacker was a different game than playing 4-3 defensive end. So the scheme fit difference was more than just nominal back then. So it is important. But at the same time, it's tough. Like obviously when the guy becomes a Packers Hall of Famer, you're kind of like, oh, we could have ended up with that guy. But it's kind of funny. Nowadays, schemes have become much, especially on the defensive side of the ball, have become much more synchronous that it would have been, I think, a bigger miss now than back then.
Could I interject on this? Because this is a great topic. I hope it doesn't take too much time. I think it's fascinating. I want listeners to know, like, look, I love scouting and evaluating every position on the field, right? That's the people like us that's our background. We love doing that. I realized, as I was moving through my years, almost 30 years in the NFL, as an evaluator a long time, personnel director, and then becoming a general manager, that the defense is really complicated to scout for. Not the pure evaluation of movement, explosiveness, how he bends around the corner, how he flips his hips as a corner. It's really when you start to think about how they're going to be projected into the scheme that you're playing, right? Understand this. A general manager, he might have final slam his hand on the table decision-making ability. But if he's smart, he needs to listen to everyone. Not only his scouts, he needs to listen to his coaches. When the coaches get involved, the coaches have a strong influence on, back to what you're talking about, scheme, where we're going to play this player. Are we going to get the most out of this player, or are we going to have a shiny subject or athlete here that we're never going to tap into because he just doesn't fit the scheme? And then you have a position coach and or a coordinator who might be against the player who's truly the best player for the team. And those two coaches ultimately could make or break this big decision you're making as team builders because they aren't behind them. This is a forever ongoing discussion and bone of contention between personnel management, and coaches. It is a bear to deal with at times.
Yeah. And you were able to work with Bill Belichick, who, famously back in the early 2000s, there were only about 2 or 3 teams running a 3-4, and famously would go after guys like Ted Washington because they were inexpensive, because they didn't fit in the 4-3. And again, like a very Moneyball-ish way to appear, you get the best nose tackle whose market isn't great because there's only 3 or 4 suitors, versus having to go after 3 techniques which are better athletes and also have 29 suitors. And again, like, there's an aspect, and Bill was so good, right? Like when I think of the Super Bowl Patriots, I think of, Mike Vrabel playing OLB in the 3-4, Adalius Thomas in the 2007 team. But then it eventually changed, right? Where, then you had Chandler Jones in the 4-3, rushing as a normal rusher and that kind of thing. And Bill Belichick's ability to go back and forth was really, truly, I felt, fundamental to what was his edge for a long time, where a lot of guys, as you said, coaches are going to be a product kind of their schemes. And they might have a difficult, as trivial as we might think of it as non-edge rushers, it's probably easier to teach an edge rusher to rush with his hand in the grass and or with standing up for some coaches. And so those are distinctions that are truly difficult to talk about from the outside, but are really real when you're in the thick of it. So speaking of in the thick of it, right? So we talked about Jeff Saturday. Now Jeff Saturday is 1-2 now, 2-1 against the spread. They played a very good game against the Eagles. They had a lead against Pittsburgh on Monday night. But at the end of the game, he got a lot of flack for the end of game situation. They get the ball with about a minute or minute and a half left. They let it drain all the way down to 25 seconds. They don't really use their timeouts, and they're very desperate at the end of games, right? And so they lose against Pittsburgh. They fall, I believe, to 4-7-1, if I'm not mistaken. And they have Sunday Night Football this week, and then they get their bye. Mm-hmm. And when you're watching, like when I watch games like that, I get frustrated because I think about how hard football is. I think about, and both of us played in college, both of us understand how difficult it is. You're making schemes and you're getting stronger, all to squeeze out a percent or two of an edge. And then your coach misuses a timeout, which is worth like 2 percentage points, or your coach doesn't go for a fourth down, which costs you 5 percentage points. And I think to myself, is it just really a product of coaches who their skill set is basically to watch film and to really evaluate their players and their scheme and to prepare for games? They don't really get to watch games sequentially and live, right? To where there's a surprise that happens. And all of us, like, I'm a junkie. I watch every game. Like so when a play comes up in a game, I'm like, oh, they should go for it there. Or that they should be calling a timeout right now. Oh, they should be going for 2 here. And there are edge cases that fool me sometimes, but for the most part, like, I'm fairly right. But that's because I'm not spending 40 hours a week watching film cut up. Is there an edge in either A, having somebody on the sideline to help a coach, which I know has its problems, or having coaches just watch more football? Like, and I know it sounds stupid, but like, watch games and sequentially to get the mental reps in.
Man, these guys watch so much video, as you know. I mean, it is unbelievable how much time they spent. To your point, Dan Quinn used to, again, it wasn't live, but he had the benefit of knowing what happened in the games. But we would run the entire game as well, the broadcast game, to give them some context for sure. So I think there are definitely people out there trying to do as much as they can, short of staying home watching the game, which they can't do, of course. It's a really, really good concept. I know if there are any coaches or former coaches listening, they'll be pissed at you for even suggesting that. But it's really interesting. I mean, as a general manager, it is a place where you literally pull your hair out, right? Because you are watching from the perspective that we've been watching from. And you also have to go downstairs after you've listened to the owner in your ear for the whole game. What in the hell are we doing? Many, many times. And then you have to go down and sit in the locker room after with the head coach. Because, by the way, after a game, normally the GM goes in, listens to the head coach, and then they go into the room together, take a deep breath, and they're looking at each other face to face. Here it is. You start having these conversations, and they're real, and they're gut-wrenching at times because you're asking that really tough question. Why in the F did you do that? That's not an easy thing to do, cleanly done after a game, of course. So we can go on and on about it. I don't want to be tangential here. Suffice it to say, it is frustrating. It's frustrating for an owner, and it's frustrating for GMs because they're not on the field. And by the way, we used to spend $150,000 on these books that these analysts would produce for us. Would go into our staff, and our staff would go through it, and everyone would be ready for it. And they would have it up in the press box in any of these decisions that were made. And yet, I mentioned this the other day, I believe, and I can't remember exactly where it was. It might have been with our friend Lindsay Rhodes. It had to do with there's so many other elements to this. Might have even been in our pod. There's so many other elements to it, right? When you make that decision, how it's going to affect your team, how it's going to affect your locker room, how it's going to affect the second quarterbacks. I mean, there's a lot on their plates. It's a lot easier when we're sitting back with a beer in our hand watching the game live on television.
Yeah, there's a really cool question here by Zach Tuman, who, by the way, is writing a really cool book on sports analytics that'll come out in the spring. Somebody who I've talked to before, a really great mind in the space. And I think, to your point, like, when I was at PFF, we competed against Champion Analytics to sort of build those books. And I know specifically when you were with Atlanta, John Taormina is one of the best at these things. It's just, there's so much. And I think this is where I think at SumerSports, we're really trying to provide an edge, which is you like look, you're one of 32 men who get to be an NFL head coach, right? So it feels so, I can imagine it feels so powerless to develop a great game plan. Like, let's say you're the Detroit Lions, right? And Thursday against Buffalo, you develop a great game plan. You go for all the right fourth downs. And this is the best team in the league, the favorite to win the Super Bowl. And you're down by 3 at their 30 with 30 seconds left, right? Everything you've done gets you to that point. And Jared Goff missing a throw to DJ Chark, right, and you win that game, right? Like, it's so hard. And again, I feel like it feels powerless, right? When you're so, and I like I think Dan Campbell has that team ready to play. And yet at the same time, everybody's giving him flack for how he managed that end of the game situation, where in his mind, it's like, no, just complete that silly pass, Goff. And in our minds, it's like, well, you could have manipulated the clock better and all this kind of stuff. And it's just like, I can understand if you're a head coach in this league, all the 99% gets you to a spot where you're beating the Bills and the best team in the league. And yet the 1% is something that you want to delegate to a nerd on the sideline. Like, to me, I think that there's an aspect of that where I totally understand why they want to take it over. I guess the question becomes is, okay, if that, and if that's something we're willing to live with, and as somebody who really, respect the hell out of football coaches, it's probably fine, right? It's like Sean McVay is a Hall of Fame head coach, but he's much better at scheming than he is the fourth down stuff, right? Are you willing to make that trade-off? Yes. You've made 2 Super Bowls and won 1. So the question is can you fortify the in-game stuff for those coaches? And is there a training program that can help them do that? Or is it just something that, look, football's a noisy game. You take the good with the bad, and you work with that. I think that's a great question to sort of think about. And why I think we're trying to do the same thing on the scouting and the team side, right? Where you're one of 32 people who've been NFL GM, and it's like you've gotten there by being so good at evaluating and decision making and all that. Do you want to delegate any of that to another person? Is, I think, a reasonable question to ask.
Well, Zachary, that's a great point Zachary made, or question. And as you're talking about it, there were times when our head, I was with 2 head coaches, of course. There were times when they were full on and the coordinators were full on understanding and accepting. Other times they would slam the door on the proverbial data scientists, right? I mean, it was unfortunate because, at times I even felt when they needed it the most, down the stretch when things were getting dusty and hot, it was like, well, if I'm going to go down, I'm going down on my own damn volition, of my own volition. That's unfortunate, because it could have saved, I believe it could have potentially saved someone. There are some great coaches out there. I don't know how many times I've been at the owners' meetings, right? And owners, hearing owners saying, I love my coach, or I loved ED, loved my coach, but my God, he just completely short-circuited. He was smart, he was rounded, he could do all of this stuff, but on those really difficult situations, he would short-circuit. And that was tough for them to take as owners, paying them $8, $9, $10 million a year. They're like, wait a minute, this needs to be the sort of omniscient person and the best decision maker always, every day. And it's not going to be the case. There are so many layers to it. I love how the league is evolving and understanding, back to SumerSports, making sure that we are understanding. You take the really good football people and you augment their abilities with some of the stuff that Sumer will be revealing in time. And then you have man and machine, not black box at all, right? The man and machine element that's going to really take these guys to a different level. And I'm excited about watching how this is going to work with the big brains like you guys that are involved in this, at the modeling level and such at Sumer. It's fascinating to watch.
Yeah, and there are ways to evaluate coaching decisions, and obviously we talked about it, with Frank Reich, for example. We look at like Nick Sirianni and how well he's done. And when you think about even somebody like Mike McDaniel, how he's obviously is scheming the heck out of the thing in Miami, but he's also giving his team a chance with some fourth downs and the timeouts and everything. And it's just, I think the water level has risen. I wrote an article last year right after the Chargers lost to the Chiefs, when Brandon Staley got a lot of flack for missing fourth downs. I said, look, it's frustrating, but we're making progress. In 2016, half the no team in the NFL went for the correct fourth downs more than half the time. And now it's about half the teams do it about half the time. So, it's frustrating. And I love watching, my issue is I just love watching football. And sometimes I get a little frustrated, but at the same time, I just went back, I literally was on the rower yesterday and I was watching a game between the 49ers and what used to be the, Washington football team from 94. And I was looking at some of the decision-making and I was like, okay, I need to stop being so angry. It's a lot better now. And that was a 49ers team, by the way, that won the Super Bowl in 1994, one of the best teams of all time. So, okay, here's a great question that we have from a listener, by the way, and this is through Twitter. If you want to follow us on Twitter, we're at SumerSports. We for game previews and analysis, but also, where you'll see this podcast all the time, where you'll get news on what Sumer's up to all the time. This is from Luke Sygosis, who's been a frequent contributor here. Should the small sample of Jordan Love looking impressive last weekend forgive Green Bay any second thoughts about their quarterback moving forward? I think trading Rodgers right now might be the most positive EV move for Green Bay. However, the risk management is tricky, and Love has a wide distribution of outcomes. Let's discuss this. So, Jordan Love it's an interesting case. We talked about this a little bit. It's different now than when when Rodgers was drafted. It's much different than when Brett Favre was drafted by the Falcons in '91 and was traded by Ron Wolf and did his thing. He was a backup to Don Majkowski. People forget that before he was even the starter. The Packers have to decide after this season whether or not to exercise Jordan Love's rookie fifth-year option, which is it's not an extreme amount of money because he hasn't done anything yet, but it's not an insignificant amount of money. Aaron Rodgers, I believe, with a trade post June 1 would be a $40 million dead cap hit, which is a lot, but it's a lot better than cutting him. And I think if he retires, it's about that as well. What do they do here? Because Rodgers just doesn't. I mean, he looks like he's got injuries. It looks like he's getting a little older. The talent there, and I think he's the most talented quarterback of all time, is just simply eroding a little bit. What should Green Bay do? Because they're in a tough spot.
Let me just first start. Guys, there's so much to say about this. The quarterback situation and the big dollars put into these guys and the decisions that are being made. I'm talking Denver, of course, talking Indy, talking Philly, whatever that may be. These are creating massive headaches for the team builders, i.e. general managers. This is a big, big deal. This wasn't just making these moves at, $8 and $9 million. I mean, these are big money deals that are potentially crippling the organizations if they don't work out. If I'm not saying we could go on and opine about Denver, and I love George Payton. That's a tricky situation right now with Russell, right? I mean, it's a tricky ass situation. Excuse my language. I get excited about it. Going back to Green Bay, personally, and I don't claim to know anything about what Brian Gutekunst's doing. I haven't talked to Goody in a couple of years, believe it or not. But what I do look at is, as a general manager, I'm thinking my initial thought on this is, let me get this guy experience. We made the move. It caused a lot of turmoil at one time within the team, within Aaron Rodgers' thought process. There was a lot of stuff going on. We finally have an opportunity to watch him. Let's watch him closely. Let's showcase him enough. My head goes ultimately to trade, of course, because how in the hell are you going to make that trade? I'm not talking trading Aaron Rodgers. I'm talking trading the young guy. He's not even young anymore, right? I'm talking about how do you have to look at that and see, are there going to be any suitors here, first of all, before you start making decisions? I personally think Aaron Rodgers is one of the very, very best, idiosyncrasies aside, because I know there's half of us that probably agitate with him beyond, other half. When you talk to some of those fired up Green Bay fans, it's amazing. I have a guy at a motorcycle shop that I deal with. He's a tried and true Packer guy. I've never heard the invective laid down on a player like he did with Aaron Rodgers. It's amazing. That said, I just think you have to look and see what you're doing with Jordan Love. You have to see what's out there for him potentially before you make any strong decisions. Because again, I really think Aaron Rodgers, get him healthy, get his head in the right spot. What's he have? 2 more years on top of this? Or
I think it's 3 after this.
3 more. And I thought the number was if they cut him outright, which is asinine, they wouldn't do that. Is it almost $100 million?
I think it's over 100 million if they cut him outright. I think that there's post June 1 stuff that they can do to spread it out. But you're like, and by the way, I taught at Wisconsin. I taught at Wisconsin lacrosse. That's where Brian Gutekunst went to college. So like I feel a little bit of a connection with him. My wife's a Packers fan, so I've seen exactly sort of what you've seen as well as far as the animosity. And there was Brett Favre was the same way. Like it has not been necessarily all that clean, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously drafting Jordan Love gave everybody Aaron Rodgers being drafted in 05 vibes and stuff. So I can see where it all comes from. But I think I agree with you. I think if Rodgers wants to play, you're talking about a guy who, I mean, you saw it. He has a broken thumb. He has bad ribs. Like, he's broken down a little bit, and he can come back and be better. The other thing, and I think that this is big about Jordan Love and why you want to play him. You saw it on Sunday, why the Packers wanted him. And I was somebody, when I was at PFF, I did not like Jordan Love's data. In fact, I wrote an article. If you can go look it up, you can see my receipts. But I wrote, I don't think Jordan Love is worth a first-round pick. But you saw why he was taken in the first round on Sunday. That guy has movement skills. That guy has a cannon for an arm. He looks like he was quick with his decisions Sunday. And like that looked like a guy when you saw, and I don't know if you remember this game, but there was a Thursday night football game in 2007 when the Packers, who that year were the 2 seed in the NFC, went on the road to face the 1 seed, the Dallas Cowboys, on a Thursday night. I think it was Brian Gumbel and somebody else calling the game. And Favre got hurt, and Rodgers came in and looked like who he was going to be. Mm-hmm. And like we got one glimpse of Rodgers, and that was enough for Green Bay in many ways. Like Jordan Love, when he plays this year, he's going to give some team the feels, right? He's a different athlete than kind of the traditional drop back guy. He's got he's got athleticism. He's got a great arm. And whether or not he's good, I think you want to put him out there and show people that you're dealing with kind of that. And again, this is heavy handed, but a Josh Allen type athlete / arm talent. And because some team's going to buy into that. And I know Zach put up a question here. What's his trade value round 2? Like if you can get a second rounder for him, you do it, I think.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, everything you're saying is right. It's fun to watch him move around. It was excited to see that first series that or whatever, as we were watching the game. Now, remember, Jordan Love, when he came out, we're not talking about leadership here. There's a difference in a leader, whether you love or like, Aaron Rodgers or not, just his personality. He is a leader. He knows how to lead. There were questions when Jordan was coming out whether he was that true leader. There were, and that can factor in. It's not factoring in right now. But again, when the crap hits the fan, you want your leader to step up. If you're thinking about what is in the future of this organization, again, that's back on Brian Gutekunst. There's a lot on him that way. They made a strong decision on this, and back on him, meaning I'm not throwing a cautionary dart, but I am saying like that's a big thing for a GM to make a decision. Who's going to be the heir apparent when Aaron leaves? They decided to keep Aaron here, of course, right? So I'll just be interested to see how the leadership plays it in if he has to take the helm for the rest of the season.
Yeah, for sure. And you make a great point at Utah State, right? He had a better sophomore year with a bunch of talent. Then the talent leaves. He struggles production-wise as a junior. That's a lot of like, when you think about playing NFL quarterback, you kind of want that data, right? You want the data. Everybody can be, not everybody, but a lot of quarterbacks can do what Tua is doing with everything around him, right? Not a lot of quarterbacks can do what Patrick Mahomes is doing, where the stat was interesting today. Mahomes is leading the NFL in passing touchdowns and passing yards. He doesn't have one wide receiver who's in the top 30 in fantasy points, right? Like there's not that many guys that can do that. There's a lot of guys that can do it with great talent. And to your point, that's a leadership thing, right? It's something that you're trying to give rise to. Now, again, Rodgers, when he came out of Cal, there were questions there that he's answered, right? So we've seen people evolve and grow into that role. I got one more question about this topic. This comes from Arjun Menon, who actually was one of my interns at PFF. He, along with one of my other interns, Tej Seth, were instrumental in Michigan gaining their second consecutive, what will end up being, I'm going to call the game on, I don't think Purdue's winning, their second straight Big Ten title and second straight appearance in the college football playoff. Arjun asks, do you think that recent failure of trading for quarterbacks, so Russ, Wentz, Matt Ryan, will scare teams from copying the Rams and trading quarterbacks. So, for example, this offseason, it's going to be like Derek Carr is possibly going to be available. Kirk Cousins might be available given his price tag in Minnesota. Do you think that teams who are kind of like the Jets, a quarterback away, right? Are they going to be afraid of trading draft capital to teams for quarterbacks like that this year?
Again, semantics. No one wants to use the word afraid in the NFL. Are they going to be concerned? Hell yes. Categorically, hell yes, Eric. There's no question they can't be. Those are big time moves, and they are game organization breaking moves potentially too. And I've said this to you time and again. You usually get 2 opportunities to pick a head coach, and you get 2 opportunities in today's NFL to pick a quarterback, man. And you know, some are back, some are a little bit more and some less, but there is no question there's uncertainty in this league about what they're doing with these veteran quarterbacks. And look, we forever, again, as GMs and head coaches, we sit in our quiet room, just the 2 of us, we slam the door and we map out everything and we start digging into the players and the uncertainty. If we sign this player on our team who we know inside out, right? And we give him money, there is a good chance that he is just going to flail and walk away with that money. That's a sad process and a sad part of it all. You want to talk about not having, I mean, there is no assurance that way at all. You have to look at your owner. And I had to look at my owner a number of times and gulp deep and tell Arthur Blank, like, you know, he is worth all of this 20 million or 30 million or whatever it is. Those aren't easy decisions to make for an organization, especially if you're feeling hot. There is a side that people would say, well, if you're feeling on the hot seat, you just throw it out there and whatever you do, you do. That's kind of not the way it works. You're trying to make the best move for the organization. You're trying to parlay it into another contract for you and your head coach so you can potentially win a championship. It's a really, really dicey decision.
Yeah, and that's something, for example, when you think about Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh, like, Douglas has made a number of great moves, the Jamal Adams trade, and Carl Lawson, I think, was a good signing for the price, and Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson and all those players. Like, again, it's back to the discussion of the in-game stuff. You think about it as a general manager, you can nail everything, right? You can nail wide receiver with Davis and Wilson, and the offensive line with Vera Tucker and Fant and Dwayne Brown and all that, and like, you can nail the defense with Gardner and CJ Mosley and Carl Lawson and those guys, and the quarterback. And we saw it this week. You get competent quarterback play, you can win football games. And like, it's got to feel powerless sometimes when it's that one variable. And I think, as somebody who's a gambler, in a past life, like the urge to just go and shove all the chips in on the most likely thing is strong, but we know that sometimes the most likely thing goes bust. And we've seen it this year in a number of different teams, and the Rams included. At least the Rams won a Super Bowl, which you like to see.
Well, look, everything you say is spot on. One last point. I'm going to go out on a limb here. There are very few general managers and head coaches, if they're being honest with themselves, they're not letting go of the quarterback that they know that can continue to take them to the promised land. That is the way it is. They just aren't. Rarely are they going to be forced by their owners if that guy is doing what they're doing. And look, make no mistake about it, John Schneider and Pete Carroll knew the ins and outs of Russell Wilson. They weren't letting him go if they didn't see a lot of these different things that we're probably seeing now. They know it. And teams know not only their players, they know how their players interact at so many levels. It's really important for everyone to know. Sometimes it seems easy from afar. You're like, well, you do this or you do that. Right. So many layers to all of this with the quarterback moves and such.
Yeah. And this gets to another sort of thought process here, because I find this really interesting. Like, the story in Cleveland this week is going to be that Deshaun Watson's playing quarterback for them. I want to talk about a little bit of a different story, which is they, when you think about their history, Andrew Berry, the GM, Paul DePodesta, one of the executives, Andrew Healy, who was famous. My co-host at PFF, George Shahuri, took an econ class with him at Loyola Marymount, is one of their VPs as well. They had, one of our former guys, Udit Ranazaria. They had Kwesi Adafo-Mensah as a VP before he became. So we're talking about a very analytically driven football team. And one of the things that people have been talking about in Cleveland lately is the fact that they've built a defense almost entirely to stop the pass. They drafted Greg Newsome, they drafted Greedy Williams, Denzel Ward got a big contract. They signed John Johnson. Their linebackers are kind of the league's nobodies, right? And they get edge players in Myles Garrett and Jadeveon Clowney. But when you look at the interior of the defensive line, you look at the linebackers, and you look at their scheme, they have been built to stop the pass. And unfortunately, this year, that has exposed them to run games that have really hurt them. We've talked about the run in the past. In this league, just to reorient listeners, like the run game is less efficient than the pass game. If you can entice another offense to run the ball more than they should, that's a good thing. But there are levels, right? Do you think this is a one-off blip, right? A season where passers aren't particularly good, passing offenses aren't efficient, rushing offenses by league level standards have gone up. Do you think that this is a cause for the Browns to reorient the way they think about building teams, which, by the way, trickles down to us at Sumer because it changes our algorithms, right? Or is it is it just getting a bad hand of blackjack and you move on with the variance and you continue to build your team as is optimal in the NFL?
Well, I mean, I'm a big believer, as you are. The league is cyclical. There's always some really interesting, cycles within the league. I will say this. I think personally, and again, Lindsay Rhodes brought this up on her podcast, right? The idea that defenses started, trimming down, so to speak, right? And to match, because we all call this a matchup league, right? If you can't run with the corner, can't run with the receiver, the linebacker can't run with the running backs or the tight ends or whatever it may be, you have no chance to survive. Now, some of these really smart offensive coordinators, and by the way, they are very smart, they'll come to the table and say, what are we doing? I mean, look, kudos to Arthur Smith at the Falcons, right? Respectfully, it's not like they're a thriving team right now, but he's getting the most out of it, as a run offense. What they're doing there is just, I'm amazed how they're gashing at times. So I just think now that you have some light ass defenses here that are going to have to restructure a little bit and figure out how, they might have to make some changes in their approach and how they're going to build their team.
Yeah, for sure. There was a time when, so this is back right around Christmas in 2020, where I wrote an article. It's on PFF. I wrote, basically, it was like, interior defensive linemen matter. And I looked at the better you were at grading. And again, PFF grades have their pluses and minuses. I think that they're very good at grading defensive linemen and run defense. But like the cool thing that I discovered was interior defensive linemen, if they grade well running on run defense one year, they'll probably grade well the next. So it's a really stable trait. And that's what you want. You don't want a player who's great one year at something and then bad, because you're buying a noisy asset to try to depersonify this a little bit. But what was really cool was I discovered that the more highly graded the defensive lineman was, the more his defense was able to run the two high shells. And the more you were able to run the two high shells, the better you were at stopping the pass. So connecting it was a run-stuffing defensive lineman who doesn't rush the passer can still affect the passing game by allowing you to run softer defenses early in the possession, or first and second down, so that teams are facing more 3rd and 7s. And if you're facing more 3rd and 7s, you're going to throw worse, right? So it's a classic example of this interconnected thing, right? Where we all look at Aaron Donald and want to draft Aaron Donald, right? A smallish defensive lineman who can rush up the field, and he's great against the run, don't get me wrong. But we try to approximate him by getting guys who can rush up the field the way he can. But what we surrender is the ability to stop the run and the ability to play the two high shells, and it ruins your defense. And so, one of the smartest teams in the league, we'll talk about them in a second, the Eagles, make no mistake, that's why they got Jordan Davis, right? And make no mistake, that's why Howie Roseman's one of the best. He sort of sees that. The Ravens, another team who are very analytical, they get Travis Jones out of UConn in round 3, who is kind of a poor man's Jordan Davis later in the draft. But it's interesting. I wonder how the Browns address this, because I think as teams catch up, right? If you're the first, like I talked about with Belichick, if you're the first guy to discover an edge there, you get the pick of the litter. If you're the 15th team to discover it, it's going to cost you, right? And so it makes for an interesting discussion topic there. with the run game and how to construct the team. And like you said, it's cyclical. And I think the teams like the Patriots, back, when you were on the team, and the teams now like the Eagles and stuff that are sort of ahead of that curve and understand that both on offense and defense, they're going to have a huge edge.
So think about the challenges that you have as, again, team builders, head coach, and GM, when you're talking about, okay, in Atlanta, we were facing New Orleans, right? And I love Alvin Kamara. And everyone doesn't want to hear this, but this is the first year I've ever played fantasy football in my life, just because I have to, because part of Sumer. And my first pick ever was Alvin Kamara. The Atlanta Falcons will kill me over that. My point is, we had Deion Jones, who is a really good football player, as you know, right? Second round, got him out of LSU, could run like the wind. We needed him to match up. There were very few people that could match up with Kamara. He ended up getting his ass down to, there were times he was down to 211 as an inside backer in this league.
Yeah.
I remember, you can flip that back when I was with Mike Smith. We had Curtis Lofton, kind of out in your neck of the woods, right, from Oklahoma. We would get him up to 50 and 55 sometimes. He'd be lumbering around, and we'd try to put him out on Reggie Bush, back to thinking about the Saints. No chance in the world, right? So it was the opposite end of the spectrum. But poor Deion Jones, when he had to take on the run, man, teams got to know us. And I was convinced 17, we come back in 17, 18, 19, they were just pushing our asses around, unfortunately.
Right. Well, and one of your pillars on that team was Grady Jarrett, who was a wonderful draft pick out of Clemson in round 5. And but he, again, is not, he's an up the field guy, right? And and as we talked about, when you're in 2-4-5 nickel all the time, or in your case 4-2-5 nickel, you need a penetrator and you need a point of attack holder, right? And and it's funny, I was so interested in teams that would take a linebacker or a safety like Dayon Buchanan and have him play Mike, and who's the guy for the Bucks? Barron, Mark Barron would play linebacker, right? And it's that's cool in coverage, but these guys would get smoked in the run game, and it's you need to complement that with some fatties in the middle of the field, and I think that that was the part that has been lost on a lot of teams, is and it's extremely hard to find those guys, right? And that's why, kudos for example, to my favorite team, the Chiefs, of Brett Veach, signing Brandon Williams to the practice squad and stashing him for the rest of the year, because they know they might play a team like Tennessee, a team that can really run the football. I think that's super smart, but really cool discussion on these kind of things, because I think this is, football, the reason why we're going to be employed forever in football is that you're not going to solve it. It's not baseball. As soon as this thing gets figured out, the two high shells get figured out, then Kansas City's already done it. They stripped their wide receiver core down to and now they face the most man coverage of any team in the league. Why? Because they can get Travis Kelce matched up against a linebacker, right? There's these things go back and forth so quickly.
But we had time. There were times when we would get a couple big fatties, so to speak, and put them in there, and then of course the really smart offensive coordinator would say get hit. Let's run. Let's just pass up a game here, because all of a sudden you'd have these guys that were lumbering around. And if you had a D-line coach that wasn't adept at substituting appropriately, which don't get me started on that, because it is a big thing in the NFL. All of a sudden you're in there, and these guys are we're going to pass on first and second down because they have the big guys in. They haven't substituted, and let's keep rolling on them. So it's a chess match for sure.
Yeah, and it gets to the last question. I think the last topic we'll talk about, and we'll get to some questions in a sec. Again, we appreciate everybody for listening here, both on Twitter, YouTube, as well as other platforms. And I think this is tied in. Every year there are teams that peak at different times, right? And I think of I think of Miami right now as a team that is absolutely peaking right now, right? I think of a team last year, the New England Patriots, peaked right now. I think Football Outsiders, and I love Aaron Schatz, but they laughed, they had him as a 33% chance to win the Super Bowl, right now. And I'm guys, regression is the rule, folks. And you have teams right now, I think of San Francisco and Miami. They're peaking right now. San Francisco hasn't given up a point in the second half of 4 straight games. Miami is, of course, a complete bust on offense. And you have teams that kind of are percolating beneath the surface. the teams that percolate beneath the surface are usually the ones that win it, right? Last year at this time, the Rams were in the middle of losing 4 out of 5 games in a row, or 3 out of 4, right? The year before, the Bucks, right? They got a late bye, but they got beat like 38-3 by the Saints in Tampa, right? They percolating beneath the surface. The Buffalo Bills, I think, are a team right now that they're, like I said, they barely beat the Lions. They're kind of percolating beneath the surface. Kansas City is kind of that way. When they won the Super Bowl in 19, they lost. Mahomes got hurt, but then they lost to Tennessee, and they were percolating. Is there? I want to see if there's something fundamental. And even your year, I think when you guys made the Super Bowl in 16, you started 7-5. You didn't start 9-0. Right. And then you hit your stride. And by then the whole league's like, holy shit, like this offense is amazing. But it's better to hit the league like a ton of bricks in January than to hit them like a ton of bricks in November and for everybody to adjust to you really quickly. Is there something to that? Am I imagining things? Am I just building a narrative off of nothing, or is that real?
It's real. You also face the other side. I've been a part of organizations and teams, Eric, where we've started really slow and we couldn't get out of our way for the rest of the season, right? I mean, that happened to us. I mean, it happened to us a few times. We started off with a horrible preseason, and then we just people stopped within the team, stopped believing and started believing that everything was going to go against us, which was very different than those earlier years. And of course, in 16, the gaining ground and gaining momentum to me is real. I personally would love it to be, again, I told you the other day, I don't want to win 4 of the preseason games and win all the games and start to tail off. I do want the gradual build. It is really, to me, it is much easier to navigate as a head coach and as an organization when you feel yourself, like you said, percolating and gaining ground versus this up and down thing. That's tough on the Constitution. It's tough on the quarterback. It's tough on the coaches. Coaches end up trying to stay late to try to figure it out. They force feed different things. It becomes really fragmented in my mind versus a nice, even climb.
Yeah, and I feel like there's an aspect of what winning feels like too, right? Like if you rush out of the gate really quickly and you become the favorite, then every win feels like a relief. Whereas if you're kind of a little bit of an underdog, right, then the wins feel a little bit different. Now that comes back, and when I come back to this and I say, okay, the Dolphins aren't the favorite to win the Super Bowl. They're just really well thought of, right? The Niners are the best team in the NFC if you look at the betting markets, but they're not the favorite to win the Super Bowl. It's Kansas City and Buffalo. So maybe I'm over prescribing a little bit here, but I do think, when people, like, the reason I think the Niners have been so good in the playoffs when they've made it, right, and there have been years where they just bottom out, is that they are such a unique offense. They're such a hard eval and preparation that I think that becomes a problem for teams. But if people know a priori, right, like early in the season, that offense is a house, then they kind of construct their game plans around kind of beating them, and it can be easier to, because as you said, the coaches are such great people in terms of prep guys. So cool. This gets us to listener questions. Thank you all again for your diligent support of this show. I know, Thomas, you got to catch a flight pretty soon back to Atlanta. Here's a question that I got actually from Benjamin Robinson. I put this in a little late, so I'm not sure if you saw this, but it was, I think, a really good question because, you have your connections, and I think, you do such a great job of giving people their flowers a little bit on the show, and they're well-deserved, I think. This is actually one for me. It's sort of like, who are the top 5 candidates that are analytics staffers in the league that could make possible, front office people? So whether assistant GMs or GMs. And I thought that was a good question because, there are people in the league who I think have a really solid chance of maybe not, like Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah is an analytics GM. And 2 years ago, he was, a director of analytics for the 49ers. So there certainly are people there. And I do think that there are, folks like, for example, Alec Hallaby, who works for the Eagles as their assistant GM, who's been with that team. And I think this is maybe the anecdote, is he's been with the Eagles since the Andy Reid era. So he's seen sort of all of the, being listened to, not being listened to. You had the Howie Roseman was the GM, and then Chip Kelly was the GM, and then Howie Roseman was the GM again. And, he's a great person. I've talked to him plenty of times. He hired one of my former interns, Zach Drapkin, to be on his analytics staff. So I know he's a good leader as well. But that's somebody who, when you think about up and comers in the space, like I think he's somebody that if he's a general manager in the future, I would not be surprised in the slightest.
Look, I love your thoughts on it. And like I told you, you keep educating me on these guys. I've become more versed in the data scientist rosters around the league than I've ever imagined. And I'm realizing, working with you all, like I daydream every once in a while how the league is going to be and what that partnership. I know I say it again and again, but my group, they weren't thinking about that. They weren't thinking about it 5 years ago. I don't know if they're thinking about it yet, but I think as they really start digging in, Eric DaCosta, very good football mind. He has a really good understanding, of analytics per, football people, of course. Howie does as well, given where Howie's from, of course. There are a number of people out there that are more and more open to talking about having special people, again, good brains, to be side by side with them, helping them in all the decision making. There are so many decisions to be made as a GM and as a partner, and I think it's important to make sure that you have intelligence around you, and obviously that's vital.
Yeah. Speaking of DaCosta, so like somebody in the chat, I'm going to post this again, said Brant Tillis of the Chiefs. Brant is more of a cap and contracts guy, but he's one of my best friends, and like I think of he's somebody where and I'm going to talk a couple of like. With the Ravens, you have, David McDonald, who runs part of their analytics group. You have Corey Krawick. Corey's one of my best friends. And like, the best part about Corey is I get to, whenever there's a move that happens within the league, I'll generally message him and just be like, and he doesn't give away stuff, but we chat about things. And when you think about how he thinks about stuff, it's sort of, it's like, it's aspirational for me. I think about like, I want to think about things the way that he does. And that's somebody who I think could possibly be in a GM chair someday. And it's one of those, again, where he's been with that team for 10 years. So like, he's best friends with some of the scouts. He's, good friends with, some of the coaches. And there's just like from me as somebody who's always been on the outside, when I've talked to you in the past for a long time, it's just like, oh my gosh, that is something I totally missed. But of course, that's the way it would be. But from my perspective, I don't see that. And it's so good, for to have context like that. And then I think conversely, for those folks who are in the league for a long time, sometimes it's okay to like hear something from the outside because maybe, I'm not embedded with some of the same, day-to-day stuff that they have to be. And so I can provide, sometimes a clearer picture of what's going on. So I think it's incredibly edifying for me just to be able to talk to these people. And Corey has been somebody who it's so much fun. Like every single time there's a move that's made, he's always like, well, did you think of this? And I'm like, oh, of course that's a possibility that goes into probability distribution.
So I was thinking about this as we've been working at SumerSports and we're working on models. I want to be very clear. I am not modeling or coding everyone, just so everyone knows. But I'm fascinated by it. I'm very interested. But being involved in what we're working on without getting into specifics, oftentimes, of course, I'm here as a football domain expert, so to speak. So I'm able to opine on how it would be from a football mind. And I've said to you, I've said to Sean Clement, who I have a great deal of respect for, Udit and Paul Saban. I mean, guys, I may give you an opinion that is a football-driven opinion for 30 years, basically in the sport, 28 in the league, 13 as a general manager. What I want you guys to do is say, that's good, Thomas. That's good. Like it's a 6. Help me get to an 8. You guys can add intelligence and thought-provoking insight for me as a former general manager, never know on another side, and to be able to say, that's exactly right. I would take what was good and make it very good or great with the insight that you guys can provide versus it's all about me. And because I've been there, I know that the world is the oyster, I think, when you're open-minded enough to look at it.
Yeah. Sean Clements worked for 2 teams, now works for us at Sumer. I think he'll the sky's the limit, I think, for him. Obviously, Paul is really sharp as well. You work with John Terramina at Atlanta. That's somebody who I think really highly of. Tom Robinson with the Cowboys, who I know we have experience with. John Park with the Colts. I think one that's kind of under the radar. Now, he doesn't work for a team now, but I did work with him at PFF. He's more of a cap and contracts guy, but Brad Spielberger, who wrote the drafting stage with Jason Fitzgerald at Over the Cap, like, he's in his mid-20s right now, so it's probably going to be a while. But, having worked, I was his boss at PFF. He's just somebody who is fantastic. This is another one which is interesting. Somebody who was my intern at PFF, Tay Seth. I think he likes media too much, but I think if the Lions offered him a GM job, I think he'd take it, and I think he'd be very good. Again, he's on the other side of 25 though, so it's going to be a while before those names I think pop up. But they're people who I think are tremendous, and what I think is so great is there's also, I think you could give me an equal number of names on the more traditional football side, and I think that all of those people are going to be really good candidates in the future, and people who I think like we're just going to lift the water level of this entire intelligentsia in sports, through these means. So it was a great question. Thanks, Ben, for being such a loyal listener and obviously a great dude on Twitter and all the work you do with Grinding the Mocks. But I thought it was a good question. I thought it was cool to get to shout out some people who are doing great work in the league that might not get all the recognition that folks get, on a week-to-week basis. So I think that is it for us. We're about at an hour, Thomas. You got to get back to Atlanta. I got to get back to writing code. But this has been a fun podcast. We really appreciate all of you guys for coming in and saying hi. Thomas, do you have any words for the road?
No, just look, man, I love, going back and forth on all this stuff. And again, I think, there are a lot of listeners here that have a really good understanding of what you do. I believe from an analytics standpoint, we need to continue to get more and more listeners from the NFL side, because there's so much here for them to bite into or chew on. And the more they do, the more we can educate in our own way. We can pitch our group SumerSports, which we love, but also ultimately pitch the big picture, right, brother? I mean, there is so much out there to grow with. And the old style approach to football, we don't even need to call it old style. Just have an open mind and grow with the evolution of the game.
Yeah. And just to preview a little bit, he's in London today. The guy lives the best life. But our founder, Paul Tudor Jones, a co-founder with his son Jack, will make an appearance at some point soon on the podcast. I know this week wasn't, with the time zones and stuff, he wasn't able to, but we will get him on. And again, he gives such a great perspective on ownership. And I know, we're going to start having guests as well from your part of the football sphere as well, Thomas. So I look forward to that. But even if we didn't have guests, just getting to talk football with you and our listeners for an hour each week is an absolute treat. So for Thomas Dimitroff, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 9 of the SumerSports Show. We thank you all for listening, and have a great week.
So.